Hey everybody, Frank Markow here. Thanks for joining me today. I want to tell you a little story. About 5 years ago, a gentleman from Norway by the name of Truls Åkerlund reached out to me and said, Dr. Markow, would you like to participate in a research project I'm doing? You see, I wrote a book called The Phenomenology of Pentecostal Leadership as part of my dissertation, and I would like to continue on that research, but I want to expand the sample of pastors that we use for the research, and I'm looking for an American participant to join me. Would you like to do that? And me, being the open-minded, adventurous kind of person I am, I said, sure, why not? Let's partner together on this research project. And so we embarked on the project. I'll get into more of the details in a bit, but in doing this, I learned a lot about the nature of Pentecostal leadership, and as we began to tease this out, we eventually created what we call towards a theory of Pentecostal leadership. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with theology of Pentecostalism, theology of ecclesiology of Pentecostalism, but to date, we were not aware of anybody that had created or tried to create a foundation for a theory of Pentecostal leadership. Now, we both come from the organizational leadership world, and there's a lot of great organizational leadership theories out there. But as Pentecostals ourselves, we wanted to sort of add something to the conversation to make a unique contribution that came from our tradition and perspective. And so what I'm going to present to you now reflects the research that we did. It was submitted and accepted for publication in a leadership journal, the Journal of Management, Spirituality, and Religion. And you can look this up and get all the gory details if you like. But this is simply going to be a summary of that research and then maybe a little more of a practitioner application for you. Because many of you are in ministry and you don't just want another theory, you want something that's going to help you out. Well, Kurt Lewin once said there's nothing as useful as a good theory. So I think this is going to be useful for you, but it'll help you maybe to take some of the abstract ideas that you've had floating around and things that you've thought and things that you've gleaned and experienced and maybe put them together in a coherent package, coherent picture, a framework, a mental framework, if you will, to help you understand what it is that Pentecostal leaders do and think and how we think about and practice our leadership, whether it's in ministry or other contexts. So, hang on as I go into all the gory details, all the beautiful details, all the wonderful details to describe what we call towards a theory of Pentecostal leadership. Now, by the way, here's a picture of me and Dr. Åkerlund taken recently at the Society for Pentecostal Studies. He's a good-looking Norwegian guy, but we like to get together periodically at this conference and reconnect. Now, leadership theory, let me talk a little bit about this. So as you may know, leadership has been studied extensively over the past 50 years, and it's led to an expansive canon of traditional and contemporary approaches to leadership. Now, the following are some of the more well-known approaches to studying leadership from a theoretical perspective. And you might be familiar with some of these. For example, trait theory, this idea that this theory posits that certain inherent personality traits and characteristics predispose individuals to be effective leaders. So whether it's your intelligence or your charisma, or whether it's your people skills, or it even could be some sort of socio-demographic sort of thing, but there are certain traits that predispose one to excel in leadership, and we all have different traits. This was one of the earliest theories that was studied, and we've come a long way since then. We know it's not just about who the leader is, but what the leader does, and behaviors and practices and those sorts of things that make effective leadership. But nevertheless, this was an early foundational theory that's still with us to a certain degree. Then there's the behavioral approaches, and this had to do with whether we focused on the task or the person, sort of balancing out our focus on getting tasks accomplished or investing in people, investing in their personal well-being. Charismatic leadership, as I mentioned, this idea that some leaders are larger than life. They have this magnetic, angelic glow, and they enter the room and everybody turns and looks at them and says, oh, there's a true leader. And this actually is probably when a lot of people think about leadership, they're thinking about charismatic leadership, these people that sort of have this larger than life magnetic personality. Now, this is important, but the research shows that this is not necessary for effective leadership. right? These folks can be effective leaders, but they can also lead organizations and churches over a cliff too, as you've probably noted and experienced over your lifetime. And then there's transformational leadership, which sort of took this idea of charisma and kind of stabilized it a little bit and added other things like individual consideration and inspirational motivation and information sharing, those sorts of things. So these leaders transform followers and in turn are transformed by followers. It's really an interesting, well-researched approach to leadership as well. Authentic leadership, this idea of being genuine, being yourself, sharing your story, letting your story inform who you are as a leader. Shared leadership, this idea of empowering others. And it's not just about a central figure sort of eschewing this traditional heroic leadership model, if you will, but sharing leadership around whoever has the best qualifications to take decisions and actions for a particular context or situation. Psychodynamic approaches gets into the sort of the psychology and the hidden motives behind leadership. Cross-cultural leadership, of course, leading in different cultures. Gender in leadership is an emerging and important field of leadership studies now, because we know there's a lot more women involved in leadership than there was, 50, 100 years ago. And so understanding the differences, the advantages, the disadvantages, the challenges that women face in leadership role is an important area of study. Inclusive leadership, how do we make sure that all voices, marginalized voices, are brought to the table and have an opportunity to contribute? Servant leadership. Now, as Christians, we like this one, right? This is the one that Jesus modeled, and there's been a lot of discussion and teaching about servant leadership. But seeing yourself as a servant first is a critical approach, important approach to leadership. And then followership, right? What do the followers have to say about this? We talk a lot about the leaders, but what do followers have to say about this? So there's actually some interesting research and study on this idea of followership and the contributions that followers make in this leader-follower interaction and dynamic. So that's just sort of where the field has been. I'm just sort of trying to give you a big picture here. And again, you can do a deep dive on any one of these areas here. I encourage you to do that. But this is sort of the way leadership studies and scholarship has evolved over the last 100 years or so. Now, let's get back to our present study here with me and Dr. Åkerlund. So in his original research, he depicted several essential constituents of Pentecostal leadership. That is, pastoral leadership in Pentecostal congregations among Norwegian pastors, because that's where he is from. A weakness, however, of this initial work was that it was limited to a small number of participants in one national setting. So hence, his study ended with the suggestion that future research should examine leadership in other contexts to determine whether these findings reflected Norwegian culture rather than Pentecostal distinctives. So when he and I embarked, we had a whole new study. I researched U.S. pastors, and we brought in some Singapore pastors, and we had some additional Norwegian pastors. So now we had a whole new group of pastors to look at this with. So this current research and presentation seek to address this limitation by studying Pentecostal leadership across various contexts, more specifically the U.S. and Singapore, in addition to Norway, which is what I just said. These countries belong to three different major clusters, and choosing a broader set of participants increases the likelihood of finding a fuller description of Pentecostal leadership that is more universal. The study will deepen the present understanding of leadership in Pentecostal congregations and further demonstrate essential characteristics of Pentecostal leadership. All right, so that's what our goal here is to demonstrate these essential characteristics of Pentecostal leadership. Now, how do we go about doing the research? Well, we took what's called a phenomenological approach. And for those of you who studied research methods, this is a qualitative method. And it looks at the first person perspective of pastors who have experienced leadership in Pentecostal congregations. So we wanted to get people who were seasoned, who've had a lot of experience, who self-identify as part of a classical Pentecostal movement. And we use what's called purposeful sampling to recruit leaders who have served at least 5 years as pastors. We collected the data by means of open-ended interviews, focusing on participants' experiences of leading and not their meanings or perceptions of leadership. And this is part of the challenge when you do this kind of research, because everybody has their own working theory, right? Whether it's one of the ones I listed before or what they've picked up from their own reading or experience of what leadership means. And so we're very careful to talk about their experience of leading and not their theology of leadership or their theory of leadership or what they thought leadership was. While that's all important for us, that's important, of course, we all have that, but we wanted to really get at what they did and what leadership looked like in the day and day, and some of the issues and concerns that they dealt with on a regular basis. And so we took these interviews and we analyzed them, and we did using an inductive and iterative method, and we analyzed the data through prescribed steps. And so I say all this to say we had a great sample. We got some great voices from experienced pastors, which led us to some of our conclusions here. Now, let me put a little pause right here. Does this research mean that these principles are applicable to everybody everywhere? No, because it's a smaller sample, and so the generalizability is not as conclusive as, say, if we did a large sample, if we had a solid theory, right? This is a bit of an exploratory study here, and we wanted to sort of get the ball rolling, so to speak. So we feel like we have a good foundation, but we also feel like what we found here is resonant with the experience of a lot of Pentecostal leaders and pastors. So as you listen to this and take this in, you might say, yeah, I can relate to that. I can understand that. I can see how all these constituent elements speak to me in my own context. So we're not saying this is a hard and fast rule or theory. It is foundational, but we also think that does have credence and is a good framework for thinking about and starting to explore more seriously and expansively about what a theory of Pentecostal leadership might look like. And that's why I call this presentation towards a theory, right? I think you get it. So let's get to the heart of the matter here. So the following is going to be an overview of the 5 constituent elements of Pentecostal leadership, which we discovered. A comparison of Pentecostal leadership to other leadership theories. And actually, I think I'm going to go a little bit light on that one in here. And then an integrated model of Pentecostal leadership. And then I'm going to give an example from the life of Pastor Jack Hayford, who many of you may know. And I'm going to be using a colleague's book, David Moore's Pastor Jack book, to illustrate one leader's, how we could see these elements coming together in the life of one leader. So hang on as I do a whirlwind tour through these constituent elements here. Now, these elements that we discovered of Pentecostal leadership are, and I'm going to expand each of these so you don't have to write all these down right now. First of all, derived authority, spirituality as core, divine and human agency in interaction, sense-making leadership, and ambivalence and tension. So the first aspect here, the first constituent element, is what we call derived leadership. This idea that God speaks, the leader listens and obeys, and having a calling and being obedient to that calling. So a prominent finding was an understanding of leading the organization on behalf of God. This notion of being led by the divine will reflect a view of God as actively engaged in organizational affairs, constantly providing ideas, corrections, or guidance to the leader as they took charge of their congregations. So paradoxically, then, they were setting direction and surrendering at the same time, right? That's an interesting idea. I'm the leader, but I am being led, right? My leadership isn't in and of myself, but it is something that I am being led to do by the Spirit of God. And I'm going to illustrate each of these points here by a quote from our participants that I feel is salient to this. So, for example, we were led, said one participant. There was a hand over us, and I surrendered to that hand. That's why I almost always pray, God, once again I surrender into your hands. Once again we surrender into your hands. There is a dimension of surrender in leadership, then, that I lead on behalf of someone else. All right, so this is an important aspect of Pentecostal leadership we discovered, is it's leadership on behalf of somebody else. Now, the next aspect here is what we call spirituality as core. Experienced spirituality, an enchanted worldview, and intuitive spiritual discernment. At the core of Pentecostal leadership is an experiential spirituality that's centered around personal and corporate openness to and encounters with God as an immanent and dynamic source of power and vitality. So on the individual level, the participants emphasize the intimate connection between private spheres of prayer and contemplation and public spheres of ministry and leadership, making it crucial for them to provide sufficient space to experience God in their personal lives. So in other words, these leaders said, my life is open and I lead as my spirituality is an important part of my leadership. My sense of God's direction and calling and leading in my life is important to who I am as a leader. And that's on the individual level. Now on the congregational level, they saw it as pertinent that they facilitated divine human encounters among congregants. In practice, the personal and corporate dimensions were integrated into a single motivation to both experience and enable connections with God. So in other words, part of their leadership was to facilitate, to enhance, to make sure that this connection between people in their churches, people were also experiencing a deep sense of personal connection with God. A quote here to illustrate, it always begins with a yearning, a pain, a particular kind of angst. There must be more to think. Growing up in my Pentecostal setting, there was always a sense of richness of experience, of wanting more, wanting to push to more of God. Your real work is maintaining and maintaining and people the sense of God in their lives. I'm sorry, my quote is cut off there by my little image there, but you can see the quote. The idea here is that these leaders yearned for the Lord, right? To press into God, to have more of God in their lives. And so they believed in this enchanted worldview that God was around them. They would reflect on things, they would intuit things. Spiritual discernment was important to them, and there was this real experienced spirituality. It wasn't theoretical, but God is real. God is amongst them, is with them, leading them, and God is with their people. Now, the next element here is what we call divine and human agency in interaction. This idea of praying and planning, innovation and surprise, and the seamless integration of spirituality and rationality. The leader's active role in discerning and implementing what they perceive to be God's will entailed that leadership in Pentecostal organizations seldom played out by divine fiat. The participants were neither monarchs nor mouthpieces. They sensed that they led on behalf of God and were thus not entirely free to pursue their own agenda, yet they could not resign to apathy, since the outworking of the divine initiative involved human agency. All right, so this idea that, yes, we're connected with the divine and we are God's instruments in this world, but we are not passive, right? That we are active, that our agency, our desire to work, our motivation, our movement, our ideas, are an integral part of this interaction, this interplay with God. So this idea of praying and planning, it's not one or the other. We don't just sit around and pray and ask God to do things. It's like we do things, and we pray as we do them. And God changes us. He directs our steps, right? He intervenes. He'll stop us. I mean, we see examples in Scripture. We've experienced these ideas that we move, and God moves in and through us and directs us and kind of fine-tunes our movement, so to speak. The leadership process thus involved praying and planning in tandem, constantly moving back and forth between the use of cognitive capacities to make rational decisions, spiritual discernment to seek God's guidance, and contextual competence to determine what needs to be done in the situation, and seeking counsel from other people, right? So Pentecostal leadership isn't like going into a closet and hearing from the Holy Spirit and then moving by fiat, right? God doesn't work like that in our lives, right? He speaks to us, of course. We understand that, but he also speaks through our actions, and he speaks to us through other people, right? So there's this sort of interactive interplay between our actions, God actions, and the reflections of other people in the congregation. A quote here, the spiritual and the cognitive must go together. then I believe we get the best. As Pentecostals at their best, live in the dance between the two. As one is not better or worse than the others. It's just that they have to dance together. I love that metaphor too, right? The dance between our action, our will, our cognitive abilities, all the things that God's placed in us, and God's hand upon us, right? And God's leading and moving. It's a mystery. It really is a mystery how these things can both be true at the same time. But it's not an either-or proposition for these leaders. The next is what we call sense-making leadership, defining reality and dealing with others. It was not enough for the participants to simply discern what God was doing. They also had to translate and articulate that into an account of organizational reality that made sense to the members of the congregation. We could sum up the leader's description of this process by comparing their inner lives with incubators, where they perceived to be what they perceived to be God's leading. It could percolate, nurture, and integrate with contextual realities in a way that was meaningful, not only for the leaders but also for the congregation, thus filling the space within the divine mandate with local meaning as well as modeling what it looked like in practice. So in other words, these leaders would discern the Lord's will, but then they would have to reflect upon that, right? This idea of incubating. I'm birthing an idea. I'm bringing to reality something that I feel the Lord has birthed in me, and then I'm explaining it to other people in the organization. Because again, we're kind of looking at this theory. It's not just about our development or understanding or connection with the divine. That's great, and there's a lot been written on that, right? Spiritual formation and those sorts of things. But our idea is how do these people actually interact and lead in an organizational context, right? So how do they work with other people to accomplish the mission of the church? A good quote here, leadership involves speaking something into reality, bringing others into a certainty, and then conducting myself in that space together with them. That's such a good quote right there. So this idea of sense-making leadership. And then finally, ambivalence and tension. All right, this is an interesting one. You're probably saying, oh, Frank, what's this about? This idea of democratic versus decisive leadership, structure versus agency, and tradition versus innovation. Now, you notice a lot of verses in there, right? So right away you can tell that there's going to be some interaction, there's going to be some back and forth, there's going to be some polarities, if you will. The paradoxical relationship between democratic and decisive leadership in Pentecostal organizations. All right, so this is an interesting one here, right? This idea that we are called by God to be the leader, right? Yet we also empower others. We bring others to the table. We give other people opportunity for meaningful roles of leadership and participation, right? So I think you see this played out a lot of times in Pentecostal churches where you have something like, well, you know, the leader will say something like, well, God told me, right? They kind of pull the God card. God told me, God said this. Well, how does that work out with other people who are also, you know, discerning and, you know, the Lord speaks to them, right? Because, you know, there's only one head of the church, and we believe from 1 Peter in the priesthood of all believers, we all have access to the Spirit of God. We all can know the mind of God. So there's this bit of this paradox and tension between the leader as, you know, God's appointed leader over a group or congregation and other people who have this same sense of discernment, right? So there's a dialectical relation, and there's also a dialectical relationship between structure and agency. That is, an experience of reciprocity between the participants' ability to influence the organization and the influence the organization had on them. All right, what does that mean? That means, look, when you step into a situation, it does not just bend to your will, right? You are in a culture, you are in a context, you are in circumstances that will also have an influence on you. And depending on the size of the organization or the age of the organization, imagine you're in a 100-year-old church with 1,000 people, right? That's pretty old. That's pretty big, right? So there's a lot of history. There's a lot of culture. There's a lot of stability. There's a lot of things that have been baked into that thing. And so as well-meaning and as spirit-led as you are, you come in, you can't just instantly change things or do things that are going to happen, right? So there's a sort of this tension, if you will, between the structure, what's established, the culture, the decisions of the past, right, and your own agency and what you bring to the table and your desire and your will and your sense of God's leading and all those sorts of things. And then the relative flexible ecclesial structure of Pentecostalism left much space for the leaders to shape their congregation. Yes, yet they must adapt to their respective expectations and self-understanding if they want to maintain influence. So again, you can't come in and assume that everything will change just because you arrived. And I think a lot of leaders kind of make this mistake, right? Oh, what's your agenda here? Well, I'm going to come in and I'm going to shake things up. I'm going to change the culture. It's going to be different around here. Well, good luck with that, because we know one of the clearest findings we know from the study of culture, which everybody's all enamored with, we want to study culture, we want to change culture, is that it's very difficult to change culture. Now, it's not impossible, but it's difficult because that culture has been around for a long time before you showed up, and as well-meaning and as talented, as spirit-led as you are, it won't necessarily bend to your will. So it's a challenge, right? So again, this is that tension. And another interesting tension I think that we feel in the Pentecostal world is the tension between Pentecostalism itself, right? You may have read the topic of this slide and say, oh, Pentecostalism, man, well, that's so, like, I don't really identify as a Pentecostal. Well, we've softened it, haven't we? We call it spirit-led. We call it charismatic. And we know as seminarians, these have nuances of meaning. But some of us have a tense and interesting relationship with Pentecostalism itself, because we know that, let's face it, there has been some weird things done in the name of Pentecostalism. And we know there's some strange leaders out there, but it's sort of like a family. And, we've all have kooky uncles and strange cousins and people that we know about. And it's like, oh, that guy, right? So yeah, but nevertheless, they're part of our family. So we have to sort of embrace that and deal with that. And sometimes I did a follow-up paper to this one here where I talked about identity and how we identify within Pentecostalism. And to a certain degree, we do identify with it, right? We identify with the good things, right? The theology and the spirit-ledness and Azusa Street and all those things. Oh, yeah, I'm all for that. But then you talk about, some of these strange, not aberration, well, maybe outliers, if you will, the snake handlers and the holy rollers and, some of these things that have been done in the name of the Spirit and all those sorts of things, right? So we kind of distance ourselves, right? So we kind of, what's called a schizo identity. It's like, yeah, I'm part of that group, but not all of that group, right? So that's kind of a tension, right, that we kind of have to deal with as Pentecostals or Spirit-filled folks, if that makes you feel better. All right, so let's kind of bring this all together here. So in some of those classic approaches to leadership that I described early on here, the main components oftentimes were things like the leader, the person of the leader, the personality, the gifts, the personality, the traits, the skills, the charisma, if you will, all these sorts of things, right? And then the follower, what were the followers like, the situation, the maturity level of the followers, and then the context. So what's the environment like, right? Is it a new church? Is it an old church? What's going on in the culture that we need to be aware of? And so where these things align, that's where you have effective leadership, right? At the intersection of the leader, the follower, and the context. Okay, so that's kind of a summary of many of these approaches here, right? They consider those three things in various ways. They do it in their own way, but that's sort of what a classic approach, classic theories of leadership look like to a large degree. Now, if you put our 5 constituent elements together, you come up with 3 big circles. Us leadership guys are big on circle models here, right? We like this. But there's different players, right? So you have on top there, you have God, of course, right? And then you have the leader and then others. Now, bringing all these together, you have these different constituent elements. So for example, spirit, you see between the leader and God, you see spirituality as core, right? Our leadership is based upon our sense of connection with God. Our authority derives from God and those things. And then you see this divine and human agency, right? So it's about praying, it's about planning, it's about working together in conjunction with our sense of the Spirit's leading and bringing others into the conversation. And then this idea of sense making, the leader makes sense and interprets reality to others. But then you also have this idea of the ambivalence and tension, right? Now, you see ambivalence and tension between the leader and God. Well, that doesn't mean we're ambivalent about God, but sometimes, for example, we're discerning people and we are challenged in our discernment, right? It's not always perfect. God doesn't always just hand us, two tablets, with 10 laws on it, right? We sort of have to discern what God is trying to say through the circumstances and through the prophetic and those sorts of things. But and then also there can be this tension between the leader and other people, and this others might not be just people in our congregation that we're having a hard time with, although we know that's a reality too, right? But this idea of the tension between our connection with the movement itself and the reputation of the movement itself, and maybe other denominations or others, other perspectives on the faith, right? And then this ambivalent tension between others and God, right? So we're trying to bring others, trying to reconcile others to God, all these things working together. All right, so it's kind of a complex model here, but hopefully this kind of brings it together so you can sort of see what's happening. This is what we would call a higher level of abstraction and integrated conceptual model. Divine and human agency and interaction, and at the center of the Leadership Act. All right, now I want to give you an example here. From the life of Pastor Jack. Pastor Jack Hayford was a great man of God. He founded our university. And I'm going to read just a brief little snippet here from David Moore's excellent book called Pastor Jack. And I think this will illustrate this here for you. This is on page 160. When God spoke to Jack about his relationship with Foursquare. By the way, in case you don't know, Jack Hayford was a Foursquare pastor. He was the president of the denomination, the founder of the King's University. And so history is about halfway through the history, right? Just as he's founding his church, he's really establishing the Church on the Way, which was one of the biggest churches in America at the time. So when God spoke to Jack about his relationship to Foursquare, the denomination, the Church on the Way, which is Jack's church, was giving the denomination $100 a month, calling it a token tithe. Their actual monthly income was closer to $2,500. So Jack knew that the token tithe was ridiculous and that it needed to change. And then he continues on, and this is a direct quote from Pastor Jack. As a result of this late night encounter with the Lord, I asked the men of our church council, which is the church's advisory governing body, to meet with me. I told them I believed we should bring our church's extension tithe to a consistent tenth, and I explained why, relating God's dealings with me on this matter when I explained how deeply it appeared to me that God was summoning us to manifest our submission to those authorities that God had placed over us in family association. The brothers heartily consented. We paid our tithe, retroactive to the preceding month, and from that date we have given it as a faithful minimum. Okay, so what's going on here? So Pastor Jack is having tensions in a relationship, right? So the premise here is that he's not giving the full tithe, right? Okay, now this is an organizational issue, good organizational issue. But God begins to speak to Jack, right, about this. And he says, look, Jack, you're either in or you're out. If you're in, then do what the denomination is asking you to do. And he feels convicted that's the right thing to do. And so God speaks to Jack, and then Pastor Jack goes to the elders, and he interpreted God's will. And he said, you know what, fellas, I believe God is asking us to be all in. If we're going to be part of this denomination, we need to commit, and we need to give the full tithe. And so he interpreted God's will to them. They heartily assented. Almost sounds like something from the book of Acts. The brothers all heartily assented, and we wrote a big check. And therefore, they made the decision to give the tithe, the full tithe, to the denomination, right? Now, isn't that a great illustration? Now, Jack could have just came out and said, we're going to start tithing. And they would have said, what's going on? We were never that committed before. Well, God spoke to me. Well, yeah. But what did he do? He sat down, he explained it to them, they reasoned together, he got them on board, right? This is good leadership stuff, right? He got them on board with understanding this, why it was necessary to do that. It started with God speaking to him, but it didn't end with him. He interpreted that, he reasoned with them, and they said, yay and amen, let's go ahead and do that, right? Okay, so there's an example of how these three things work together, right? God speaking, he was praying, they were planning their budget, he was interpreting God's will to them, they were dealing with the tension that they had with the denomination and this whole idea of the tithe, and they made a decision to move forward. Cool example, huh? I thought so. And so we see all these things working together, right? Divine and human agency, etc., etc. Well, That's it. That is the elements of what we call towards a theory of Pentecostal leadership with the 5 constituent elements. I tried to connect it to what we know about leadership theory, and I gave a good example. Now, I want to end this lecture here with something for you to think about. How is your leadership God-focused? What is your sense of derived authority, your sense of calling? How is spirituality at your core? How are you hearing from God as part of an essential part of your leadership? And how do you and God work together in practical matters? And some leaders say, well, I pray and all those things, but God leaves the planning up to me. Well, maybe he does, but hopefully you're hearing from him and there's sort of an iterative back and forth practice. How does that happen in your life? And then as well, how is your leadership other focused? How do you define reality for others? Do you come out of the closet and say, well, God said, and therefore you got to do it? Or do you sort of interpret God's will? Do you listen to others? Do you listen to prophetic voices? Is there some back and forth in your decision making, right? Is your sense of God's leading confirmed by others' sense of God's leading? And how do you teach and model truth, right? And again, we know what we know about organizational leadership and culture is that culture is largely shaped by what leaders do. Not what they say, but what they do, how they model behavior, because we know that actions speak louder than words, right? So how are you modeling truth to others? And then how do you deal with the tension and ambivalence in your leadership in terms of decision making, in terms of innovation and change, in terms of the Pentecostal tradition, right? So this idea of ambivalence and tension, it's not a stranger. It's kind of baked into what's part of our leadership, right? Because it's not all clear directives. It's not stone tablets, right? We have the Word of God as a directive, but there's a lot of room for interpretation, right? And how does that play out in the day and day? And so how are you dealing with some of that? How are you dealing with your relationship with the Pentecostal world, even the term Pentecostalism? Did that make you chafe when you first opened up this presentation? Or are you like, hey, I'm cool with it, man. I'm part of the family. Or do you kind of soften it a little bit? I'm one of those, I'm not Pentecostal, I'm Spirit-filled, I'm charismatic, right? And that's okay. I'm not bagging on it, but think about your relationship with the Pentecostal world, with some of these other tensions that we experience, right? The here and not yet, or the here and not here, the already and not yet. I mean, all these interesting theological tensions we deal with, particularly in a Pentecostal context. Well, listen, that is it for my presentation. I hope this was helpful. Make some comments below. Let's keep this conversation going. My contact information is available as well in my YouTube bio, and I'm glad to engage with any of you if you'd like to keep this conversation going. Let me know what you think. Keep in touch. I hope this was helpful. God bless you. Thanks for listening. Frank Markow. Peace out.